Hello, I'm Dr. Joseph Mpachi.
And I'm Miss Joy Baseke. In the first 17 minutes of this video, we'll introduce and describe the horrifying future your country is heading into unless an intervention is implemented. In the next 13 minutes, we'll reveal and explain the reason why your country is heading into that undesirable future. In the last 8 minutes, we'll describe the intervention that will save your country. The introduction.
Countries that make up sub-Saharan Africa have far more in common than they have in differences. For practical purposes, therefore, we will select and focus initially on one country, Uganda, in an effort to reveal the reason why your country is heading into a horrifying future. But first, a brief description of Uganda.
Uganda is a landlocked country in East Africa that was colonized and ruled as a British protectorate for about 70 years, from 1894 to 1962. It gained independence in 1962. In the first 50 years of independence, however, Uganda suffered episodes of violent conflicts. The country became relatively stable and peaceful after the National Resistance Movement, NRM, captured power in 1986. Apart from ushering in an era of relative peace and stability, the NRM government is credited for restoring and growing Uganda's economy. The NRM government has been in power for more than 30 years under the leadership of President Yoweri Museveni. Uganda's biggest problem.
If you randomly sampled adult Ugandans and asked them the question, what is the biggest problem of your country? More than 90% of the responses will point you to politics or leadership. The remaining few will mention poverty, corruption, or tribalism. Even when you go to Uganda's top universities and sampled staff or students, you are likely to get a similar pattern of responses. In other words, you'll be shocked at the level of ignorance about this country's biggest problem. But that shock will be an unfair response because Uganda's biggest problem lies hidden away from the common eye. In the same way, a bacteria that causes disease lies hidden away from the ordinary eye. But however hidden it might be, that bacteria soon betrays its existence through the disease it causes. Understanding this disease is usually the starting point in identifying the responsible bacteria. In a similar way, Uganda's biggest problem betrays its existence through the impact it exerts on the country. Understanding this impact is the starting point in identifying Uganda's biggest problem.
The impact of Uganda's biggest problem.
The process that moves society out of underdevelopment is never a one-time event, but occurs slowly over a period of time. Along the way, however, this process can be quantified to assess the economic progress that country has made. One of the commonest approaches employed in assessing economic progress of a country are the changes in the size of its economy over a period of time. When we examine the size of Uganda's economy in the first 50 years of independence, the impact exerted by this country's biggest problem comes out very clearly, namely the inability to get out of underdevelopment.
Within these first 50 years of independence, Uganda was ruled by several presidents, implying changes in the country's leadership. But these changes had no impact on Uganda's inability to move out of underdevelopment, suggesting that the underlying cause, or this country's biggest problem to be precise, was intrinsic in nature. Let us therefore examine in the next few minutes whether Uganda's biggest problem is intrinsic in nature.
Uganda celebrated its 50 years of independence on the 9th of October 2012. During the celebrations, government acknowledged that although Uganda had made progress on a number of fronts, it had remained essentially the same, namely an underdeveloped economy. Accordingly, a national development plan named Vision 2040 was launched to inform and guide Uganda's subsequent efforts out of underdevelopment. The new development plan forecast Uganda's economy to expand from GDP of about United States dollars 24 billion in 2012 to GDP of United States dollars 580.5 billion by 2040. Earlier on, however, PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the biggest consultancy firms in the world, had forecast a modest expansion of Uganda's economy. Thus, the key question before Uganda in 2012 was, which path would the country follow? Vision 2040 or PricewaterhouseCoopers forecast? As this graph clearly indicates, Uganda's economy may indeed be growing, but the biggest size it can expand to by 2040 is consistent with PricewaterhouseCoopers forecast.
In other words, that by 2040, Uganda's economy will still be in the same direction it has been since independence. This direction is the outcome of Uganda's inability to move out of underdevelopment. In brief, Figure 4 supports the view that Uganda's biggest problem is intrinsic in nature. Elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa,
The intrinsic inability to get out of underdevelopment is, however, not limited to Uganda, but cuts across sub Saharan Africa. The Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, a German based organization, published this report in 2017. In a foreword to this report, Malaike Ripeli, the resident representative of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Uganda, wrote,
in December 2011, The Economist's cover title of Africa Rising kicked off global media coverage of Africa, which saw the African continent at the forefront of economic growth and development. Though this had a nice change from the usual doom and gloom reporting about Africa, it soon became obvious that the impressive GDP growth rates of the continent were largely due to China's strong economic performance and its concomitant high demand for natural resources, which boosted their global demand and prices, but did little to create jobs and to improve household incomes. At the end of it all, when China's growth rates leveled off, many African countries were left with the same problem as before: high levels of poverty, rising inequality, population growth which outstripped growth in employment, and an economic structure which had not fundamentally changed during 50 years of independence.
that paragraph clarifies that although many sub Saharan countries managed to register impressive economic growth and GDP expansions over the past 20 to 30 years, the efforts to kickstart transformation of their economies were largely unsuccessful. In other words, that sub Saharan economies remained in the same direction they have been following since independence, and which direction is an outcome of the inability to move out of underdevelopment. This then raises the question, why is it that sub Saharan countries find themselves unable to get out of underdevelopment, no matter how well governed they become, how well endowed with natural resources they are, or even when their annual incomes rise to the middle income status?
The answer to that question is in part 2 of the video. Before we exit this part 1 of the video, however, let us look at where your country is heading because of its intrinsic inability to get out of underdevelopment. The future horror of your country. The force that is driving sub-Saharan countries towards a horrifying future is comprised of 3 distinct sub-forces, namely their inner force, the middle force, and the outer force. Let us look at each of them, starting with the outer force.
Underdevelopment can be defined in several ways, but the definition that is most relevant to the common man is to explain underdevelopment as that stage in a country's socio-economic progress where opportunities are for a handful few relative to the population. Consequently, the inability to move out of underdevelopment means condemnation of the majority of the country's population to a perpetual lack of meaningful opportunities. This condemnation in some countries translates into specific ethnic group or groups taking up nearly all the available meaningful opportunities and thus stirring up ethnic resentments and tensions.
The middle force.
But whether the persistent scarcity of opportunities deepens ethnic divisions in your country or not, it is said to extinguish the kind of hope that was lit by the prospects of your country's demographic dividend. Unfortunately, instead of getting extinguished, that kind of hope might overturn and start burning upside down. In other words, if the young people in your society become increasingly excluded from opportunities, their contribution to your country's socio-economic development will be limited. Worse still, they may become a hinge for turning your country towards persistent lawlessness, high levels of criminality, perennial instability, radicalism, and so on. In short, they may render your country increasingly difficult or costly to govern as it moves on into the future.
The inner force.
But even if your country successfully contains the challenge posed by the huge numbers of young people who are either unemployed or underemployed, and it gets governed properly into the future, its intrinsic inability to move out of underdevelopment in this next 50 years of independence will usher in a horrifying era. The era will be horrifying because in the next few decades, and especially from 2050s onward, the world is going to be extremely different from what you see it today. President Emmanuel Macron, the 25th President of the Republic of France, described it probably in the best way possible, namely a harsh and unforgiving world, especially to those who are unprepared.
Taken together, the 3 sub-forces we have just looked at reveal that sub-Saharan countries can be compared to the legendary house in the Bible, which was built on sand and could not remain standing when the windstorm came.
Look at it this way. In terms of surface area, Africa is so big that when China, India, United States of America, Europe, and Japan are combined, they can all easily fit into it. Furthermore, it is common knowledge that most of Africa's land is endowed with natural resources. But most importantly, about 60% of the world's arable land is found in Africa. This means that a far less than 20% of the world's population is in possession of 60% of the global arable land. This has a very important implication for Africa especially in the following three ways. As the 21st century advances on, sub Saharan Africa will become increasingly precious to the world, especially because of its huge arable land. At the same time, the intrinsic inability to get out of underdevelopment means that sub Saharan countries will continue to engage the world from a position of weakness, even after these countries have integrated fully. Meanwhile, the global superpowers, especially China and India, will be facing increasing pressure to meet the feeding lifestyles of millions of their households who will have joined the middle class. Together, the three factors will catalyze a new scramble for sub Saharan Africa, which will end into a recolonization or an alternative form of control of the subcontinent by the global superpowers. But whether it is a recolonization or an alternative form of control, the right to own land and other rights, including economic, cultural, social, and political rights in sub Saharan countries, will be rolled back, and some rights done away with completely in order to meet the interests of the new colonizing master. This might sound strange to your ears now, but it will be the norm in that harsh and unforgiving world we are heading into, especially from 2050s onward. In summary, your children, if you are still a young parent, or your grandchildren, if you are an old parent, will pay a heavy price for your country's inability to get out of underdevelopment, regardless of their educational level.
The last part of this video is therefore about addressing the underlying cause of your country's inability to move out of underdevelopment. But before we proceed to that last part of the video, it is important to understand the underlying cause itself. In other words, to understand your country's biggest problem, we now turn to part 2 of the video.